Botelho, and I have the pleasure of guiding us through the final session of the day, which is about where we're going. So you may not have realized this, but we wandered around campus to have lunch today, but you've also been served a Symposium sandwich. So I'll tell you about that sandwich. The first part of bread, and sorry for those of you who are gluten-free and the rest of it, but so that first slice of bread, I had to have a cheesy metaphor. So the first slice of bread was our introductory session, and we talked about policy and some background, and we were guided through that process. Then we had some filling, whether it was fish or cheese or avocado, of the science and technical sessions. And this panel here, and we'll have some other guests, are going to provide you with that top piece of bread to finish off the sandwich. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the format today for this particular session. So we have two parts. Our panel will each speak for 10 minutes on where, from their perspective, where we're going from here, what our opportunities are. And then we will invite a couple of other speakers who you've already heard from today for a broader discussion on where we're going from here. And we'll be able to field any of the questions that you had on the question cards earlier, so it'll be a more general question session. So if you do have a card that you haven't handed down, you can scooch down and pass it to me right before we start card 2. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our esteemed panel. So we have at the very end Ken Warren, who's here from the Government of Canada. He's had a long career in working in First Nations and government relations through several different roles. Jim Heffernan, who is with the Columbia River Intertribal Fishery Council. Commission. Yes. We have Alexandra Banford, who's with the BC Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. We have Jay Johnson, who is here from the ONA, who's a senior policy analyst and negotiator for the Okanagan Nation Alliance. And we have Elliot Tinbasket, who's here from the Penticton Indian Band. So those are your speakers for today, and we will kick it off with Jim.
Do I just speak really loudly, or is there a microphone?
Oh, I'm sorry. The microphone is right beside you.
Do an interpretive dance.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak to this group today. I especially appreciated that most of the speakers recognized and acknowledged they're on First Nation land. Sometime soon in the future, I hope that that is a regular statement to open every conference in the U.S. as well. Really appreciate that. I used to work on the Pacific Salmon Treaty for the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, and then I took a break, and they asked me to come back and take a look at this treaty, and how would you make this treaty operate like the Pacific Salmon Treaty? That is, how would the tribes participate in its implementation? And so that is what I wrote up. And that is, a shorter version of that was included in an accord that the treaty tribes I work for entered into with the action agencies, Bonneville Power, Corps of Engineers, and the Bureau of Reclamation. What that vision entailed, because it was me translating actually a tribal vision, because this is something they had done. This is something that had been done since time immemorial. This is something they did at Kettle Falls, there on the right, and Celilo Falls, here on your left. Traditional fisheries lost with the development of the Columbia River system, but these were fisheries managed by the tribes and First Nations since time immemorial, providing for their people. How do you do that in a system that's been harnessed, that's been controlled by hydropower systems? What are your objectives? First, you need a voice. You want representation. There are river chiefs that manage these fisheries. The tribes need a seat at the table. That is the first thing that they want. Second, what you've heard throughout the day was that the Columbia River Treaty, though there was a request sent in to the IJC to look at a full suite of benefits that could be shared through the treaty, Over the course of the technical investigations, it was narrowed down to optimizing hydropower and providing for flood risk protection. So fish and wildlife, irrigation, those were stripped away. And the thought was that both parties could manage those issues on their own domestically. In fact, in the treaty, there is an explicit reservation for both parties for domestic use of water, for irrigation municipal. So that's already covered in the treaty. In fact, I had one person remind me that in the protocol it says that the parties agreed that there is a right provided in the treaty to withdraw water for irrigation. I thought to myself, really? If one of the parties terminates the treaty, that means you can no longer withdraw water for irrigation. Maybe the tribes want to terminate the treaty in that case to make sure there's more water staying in the river for fish. But the tribe saw it as a mistake that the focus went to hydropower and flood risk management to the exclusion of ecosystem function. So they want to see ecosystem function, which includes fish passage reintroduction, integrated into a modernized treaty. It's an opportunity to recognize that in the technical studies leading up to the current version of the treaty, the assumptions were that we can engineer our way out of this problem. That was the assumption made, in fact, when the decision was made to flood Kettle Falls. At the same time Grand Coulee is being built, Bonneville is being built. They started the same year. Neither dam was going to be built with fish passage. Fortunately, folks downriver of Bonneville fought that, and fish passage was included at Bonneville. But the engineering aspect of it was, yes, we're going to lose fish, but we'll build hatcheries. And so if you look at the first set of hatcheries built in the US to mitigate for hydropower construction, they're Mitchell Act hatcheries, for the most part, built below Bonneville Dam. Lastly, what the tribes are looking for is equitable distribution of benefits. There's been a lot of back and forth today about payments for the flood risk management benefits that the US made to Canada. Very valuable, no doubt, though the tribes question why people insist on building in the river. Because if you are standing in a floodplain, you are standing in the river. Why do you insist on doing that? Why do you insist on rebuilding in the river once you are flooded out? You should have learned a lesson in '48, or an even better lesson for Portland in 1896, when those floodwaters reached pretty far up into the downtown core of Portland. So, but those payments for flood risk went to Canada. We talked about downstream power benefits and sharing those downstream power benefits at increment, and that benefit goes back to Power X, BC Hydro. That goes to the province. Tribes' lands were flooded, providing flood risk protection. Lake Roosevelt sits on the Colville Reservation and the Spokane Tribes Reservation. SQK Dam, formerly Kerr Dam, is one of the 8 system reservoirs providing flood risk protection. It sits on Confederated Salish Kootenai Tribes' lands. When the hydropower system was constructed, tribal villages were lost, tribal fishing sites were lost. There were a lot of benefits going around, but none of those benefits came back to the tribes or the First Nations. In fact, they lost things. So that would be the third thing, an equitable distribution of benefits from a modernized treaty for the costs that the tribes bear to provide benefits to everyone else. I often hear, what is ecosystem-based function? Little pamphlet out on the table, a long definition in the booklet of ecosystem-based function. It was a question that came up when the tribes first started working with the US entity on a charter for the sovereign participation process that led to the regional recommendation. We actually put ecosystem-based function in the first version of the charter, and they said, we didn't know what you meant, so we just put salmon fisheries back in there. So you have a very explicit description of what ecosystem-based function means. More stable reservoir operations, flows, returning some of the spring and early summer freshet, avoiding late summer hypoxia in the estuary through flow regimes. But it's not eliminating all of the benefits of the treaty. It's restoring some of ecosystem-based function, because to create the benefits of power and flood risk, that came from somewhere, and that came from ecosystem-based function. It was paid for by the tribes and First Nations. Last thing I'd like to touch upon, and you saw a little bit about it with the non-power uses agreement that are currently available under the treaty as a way of addressing ecosystem-based function. Because I've heard some people say that the current treaty can do that. It can with limits when there are mutual benefits that the parties agree to. And that is a very strict limitation. It's 1 million acre-feet of water provided for salmon flows. If you were to add up all of the water under the biological opinions currently in operation in the US on various stocks, I'm told it's somewhere between 8 to 12 million acre-feet of water that's needed to be shifted in time. I think what the tribes are looking at from their modeling exercise in the dry to moderate water years is somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 6 million acre-feet. Perhaps a little bit more, perhaps a little bit less, depending on whether or not that water is flowing in the river or if it's spilled, because we get better survivals for juveniles going out of the river with spill. And that's what I'd like to leave you with for any questions you might have later on.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you and good afternoon. Again, my name is Alexandra Banford. I'm a chief negotiator with the BC Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. And I wasn't here in the morning, so I did want to acknowledge that I'm a visitor on the territory of the Wasanich, Lekwungen, and Wyometh peoples of the Coast Salish. And I'm grateful to be here as a visitor to talk with everyone today. I've been working for the ministry for almost 8 years now. I've worked up in the Northeast with our Treaty 8 partners, where we were working together on the impacts of the WCA Bennett Dam, as well as the proposed Site C Dam. And the lessons learned up there have definitely informed the approaches that we're now seeking to take in the south area of the province, and specifically our work with our 3 Indigenous partners in the Kootenay boundaries and in regard to the Columbia River Treaty. So in preparation for today, I actually thought about history and thought about 1964 and how far we've actually come in Canada and in BC since 1964. And there's a couple big milestones that I thought it was important to mention. So since 1964, we've had the ratification of the Canadian Constitution in 1982. That was 18 years after the treaty, the Columbia River Treaty was signed. In 1997, we had the Supreme Court of Canada decision on Delgamuukw, which was the first time that Aboriginal title had been affirmed in Canada. That was 37 years after the Columbia River Treaty was signed. And in 2014, we had the Silkatine Supreme Court of Canada decision, which was the first time Aboriginal title had been declared in Canada. And that was, well, I'm not going to do the math, but that was very recent. So those are 3 very important milestones where today we're talking about where to now. How do we actually take the last 54 years of context, legal landscape, as well as relational landscape, and think about what needs to change? And so what's changed for me in my work is that both my federal partners and my provincial colleagues, we've now both adopted and implemented the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP. And that's one of the common threads that we now have federally and provincially, is our commitment to those principles and those standards of conduct that we're going to hold ourselves to. And one of the fundamental principles that our BC government is very focused on is the inherent right to self-determination of nations in a provincial context, in a national context, and how we need to be working together today going forward in really supporting the nation rebuilding and the self-determination of our nation partners, and particularly the Shikwapam and the Silks and the Tanaha peoples in this context. This shift nationally and provincially is, I think, I folks realize is just one part of a much larger shift across the world where we're seeing a resurgence of Indigenous strength building and revitalization. Canada is not alone. North America is not alone in the way that we're trying to interpret UNDRIP, in the way that we're trying to make meaning out of self-determination with our partners, and how we're thinking about new ways of making decisions together on the land and sharing in economic security on the land with folks who have been here for much longer than we have. So that's sort of the larger global context that we're operating in. And I'm going to take a few moments to talk about the BC landscape. I'm going to talk about BC's commitment to the work with our Indigenous partners specific to the treaty negotiations, and I'm going to end with a few questions for reflection as we get into the dialogue. So in BC, we're in I think as folks are aware, we're in a transformative time. Under a new government, we have a renewed mandate to reconciliation. We have a mandate that's gone further than we ever have in BC's history in terms of working as true partners with our Indigenous nations. And that includes the inherent right to self-determination. We're committed to working respectfully and in true partnership with our Indigenous partners, guided not only by the principles of UNDRIP, but also the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, direction from recent case law, and most recently, a set of 10 draft principles that guide BC's conduct with our Indigenous partners, which are very similar to the 10 principles that our federal partners released. These principles, once they're finalized with our Indigenous partners, they're draft. Once they're finalized, they're actually going to be guiding the work of 24,000 public servants across the province who work in 200 distinct fields of work. And this is, again, not only have every provincial ministry in the province received a mandate for reconciliation at the first time in our government's history. We now have guidance, more operational guidance for public servants, regardless of in what ministry, about what self-determination means, what UNDRIP means, and how everyone can bring that to life in their day-to-day work. So we're very excited about that. It's very important, and we'll be working with our Indigenous colleagues on making those principles real in the months to come. The other thing that I wanted to make a very strong point about is that none of this is work and none of these conversations can happen in isolation. When we're talking about Indigenous relations, we need our Indigenous partners beside us, which is why I was very happy to see the roster of speakers today. You know, we have Cookby Christian in the room as a chief. We have other, senior reps from nations. And that's part of how we're going to be doing business differently, is in making sure that we're all in the room together, talking together. We also have good examples that we're learning from in BC. So outside and beyond the Columbia River Treaty table, we're making important efforts with our Shikwappam and Tanaha and Silks partners and building new patterns of relating, working to instill Indigenous ways of knowing, including legal and governance processes, into our shared bodies and structures. And that is not an aspiration. That is where we're going. That is what we're doing. And there's a lot of work there, but that is an important commitment from the provincial government. Moving to a place of equity and respect and recognition takes time. As my minister, Scott Fraser, likes to explain, we are trying to move a massive ship, whereas before, as a MLA, he was in a Zodiac bombing around that huge ship. And turning the ship is significant. But it's in the degree of change we're working to chart together, the depth of history we're trying to unpack is also significant. But it's the work that we've committed to doing together, and we have a very strong conviction that together we can fix it. So what does this mean in the context of a multilateral international treaty negotiation? For BC, it means transforming the status quo and working to advance institutional change. As we know, Indigenous nations in Canada and the US were not engaged in the original 1964 treaty negotiation. In our review of the treaty in 2013 and in subsequent years, we've actually come together in new ways with our Indigenous partners. Over the past number of months, that deep dialogue has, I would say, intensified. And now we're looking at ways to actually create a longer-term partnership structure with the Indigenous nations within BC to ensure that that principle of self-determination, that voice as an equal partner, is strong. What that looks like on the ground is that Canada and BC have ensured that we're aligning our efforts. We've ensured that we're being intentional about the shared structures that we have domestically, that we're being impactful in the way that we bring negotiating positions to the table, the way that those positions have been informed by an Indigenous way of knowing, and that we're being innovative in how we're bringing our commitment to things like UNDRIP and the 10 principles to life. I also think it's important to note that we're starting to use phrases like partnership and equity and true government to government in a very intentional way. And it's not about consultation in a transactional way of being anymore. It's actually talking about power balance and a different way of operating with one another. So it's very important, to be aware of our language and what the commitment is behind that language. So when we talk about our Indigenous partners and when we talk about what true partnership means, we're really trying to turn that ship and talk about what watershed governance in BC and in BC means, guided by the Indigenous leadership. So 3 questions that I'll end with just for reflection and consideration. The first is, how are Indigenous rights recognized and how will they be enhanced this time around? And I think from my perspective as negotiating partners, BC's Indigenous nations will be directly informing our negotiating positions. There will be tactical conversations we have. The deep level of engagement that we've had over the past number of months will continue. We also have, I would say, an important level of institutional change at both federal and provincial levels, where we're ensuring space for an Indigenous voice, as well as recognizing an Indigenous governing authority in BC. And what I mean by that is the right to self-governance, the right to self-determination, and the right for the Indigenous voice to be part of domestic decisions. The second question is, what gains are being created today and what will this mean tomorrow? What are we gaining today? What is Canada going into the negotiation seeking to gain? And I think most importantly is the work we're doing right now and the partnerships that we're building with our Indigenous nations is legacy work. It won't happen overnight. It won't happen a year from now. 54 years from now in 2072, we'll be looking back and thinking about how well we did in implementing title and rights as it relates to CRT in BC. We'll be thinking about how we supported nation rebuilding, how we supported a regional identity, taking into account the regional geography, the regional government, economy, and and the economic security of the region as well. So those broader community relationships in 2072, what have we done? I'll also note that place-based partnerships, I think, is really important. So the way that we have an impressive representation of people that have engaged in the basin, have engaged in this place, put decades of work in, and are part of that regional identity. How are we actually creating a place-based partnerships, weaving in all levels of governance and ecosystem values from the Indigenous perspective and the and our other governance perspectives. And I'll just close with my third question, which is, how do we seize opportunities in times of transformation? And I think we're in a pivotal time right now where there's hard decisions that are being made as recent as last week. There's hard discussions that we need to have, both at the negotiating table as well as beside. And there's hard work that we have to do to really chart new territory as influencers and as champions of a changed relationship. So from BC's perspective, we're very grateful to be working with Canada and the US in these negotiations. We're grateful to be building strong partnerships with the 3 Indigenous nations. And we're looking to make change on the ground and walk the talk that we've been talking about for a number of years now. So I look forward to hearing either from the sky or from the ground what happens in 2072, and look forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Before I begin, I just want to follow my protocol, and I have a gift here for Mary Sam for her opening prayer. Just want to gift some tobacco and a bundle of sweetgrass, so that just to extend from our nation to the nation here. So I just want to pay that respect at this moment if I can. So wai chas skokwast in chai squeeze kukalal kintel sen pinkton nas sukanau kain tim hulauch nas seal tim hulauch. I just want to say thank you to each and every one of you for the opportunity to sit here and share a little bit. My name's Elliot Tenasket. I'm from Penticton, the Okanagan Valley Seal Nation, and I'm here as a representative for the Okanagan Nation. So if I can just take this here for a second. So the message that I was told to bring to share with each and every one of you as a gift, like this gift here for Mary Sam, and again, I say thank you to her, but the gift is of story. So I was told to talk about culture, and much of the seal culture is embedded in story. Many of these stories have markers and signify a place or a purpose, each having a space and time in which to be shared. The story that I'm going to talk about is a story of a promise of life, bundled into a complete package known as a seed. The seed knew it was going to require some help in order to grow. From the darkness, a noise could be heard. It was a flock of sand cranes. Seed called out to the sand cranes, "Go and tell the north wind he must come greet me by wrapping me in his great white robe, so I may rest long enough to gather my energy." Sorry, thanks. "While I am resting, go and tell south wind that she must come and awaken me with her warming voice." The cranes done as Seed had asked. As Seed awoke, out came 2 little arms. They stretched out and began rubbing Seed's eyes. Before long, Seed started to see the world for the first time, and it noticed a figure off in the distance. It appeared to resemble a pillow. As the seed's vision became clearer, it came to know that figure as its new friend, Cloud. It called out to Cloud, "Can you bring me some water? But don't bring me too much or I may drown. Don't bring me too little or I may wilt and disappear. If you bring me just the right amount, I will be able to stretch as far as I can so that I can be closer to you." Cloud did as Seed asked. Cloud told Seed, "You must hurry as we can only visit for a little while because I will have to go back to my ocean home." Seed asked, "But I'll come back to you and visit every chance I get, and with me I will do my best to bring you the right amount of water." In leaving, Cloud said, "You might want to find some other friends so you're not alone while I'm gone." Seed begins to look around as he sees all the faces emerging from the woodworks as Cloud retreats back to its ocean's home. "Will you join me?" Seed asks, "and in return I'll grant you the promise, or I'll offer you the promise of life." You know, this is something that we're told in our culture when we express ourselves, when we share information. A lot of it's done in story form. And sorry for my reading and having to look down. But this story, I was told yesterday that I would be here to speak to each and every one of you. So as I was sitting here listening to the conversation going on, this is what was playing out in my mind about what it is that we're talking about here. And how can I put that into story? How can I be a part of that story? How can we all be a part of that story? Because the outcome of this and where we're going to go, how we're going to move forward in this, we're each going to have a part to play into that story. We're each going to be able to contribute the pages that we do. And when we look at culture, what does it mean to culture something? You know, it's the life that we have around us. You know, and whether it's your background is academics or politics or economics or all those different things, you know, we all have our part to play. You know, and when we look at the stories, the songs, all the things that make us who we are and contribute to the benefit of the land, you know, those are all questions that we need to look inside of ourselves and ask ourselves, you know, how am I going to help seed grow? How am I going to help that life grow? How am I going to be a part of that life? You know, we're told that those seeds are like the information, you know, or our children. You know, you can water them, you can nurture them, you can bring them up to maturity, and they'll grow fruit. You know, and each one of us will be benefactors of whatever fruit is produced. You know, and that cycle can continue. You know, so to share that messaging from a nation standpoint, that's really the message that we want to get across. You know, is that we want to be a part of the life that's going to continue for each and every one of us. You know, that all of us are able to benefit from that fruit, you know, be able to benefit from what it is that we have to share with one another. Excuse me. But I also want to allow Jay to have an opportunity to speak, you know, and be able to address some of the nation's standpoints in terms of the technical work and those things. So I hope that that story just allows to paint a little picture in your mind, you know, when you leave from here, that, you know, you'll reflect on some of those words, you know, and I apologize for maybe not being the best storyteller, but, you know, there are other stories to tell, you know, and I look forward to being able to listen to the story that we're going to create together. So, He White Limlimt, thank you.
So I think there's a mic there.
Limlimt Elliott. Why Huskell Health, Chai-Soon Squeeze, and Jay Johnson. I'm honored to be here. I want to acknowledge the unceded territory that we're on of our coastal Salish relatives and the Lakwian speaking people and Esquimalt and Songhees, et cetera. And maybe just talk a little bit about how we got to where we are today and some of the interests of the nation in the Columbia River Treaty and what the treaty represents, and hopefully acknowledge the both amazing opportunity we have and the tenuous and potentially fragile situation that we're in today. And I want to thank our neighbor and Chief Wayne Christian for his comments today, this morning, and the leadership that he's shown on this really critically important file for many, many years. And the wherewithal to work across boundaries with nations and in order to identify some of the common concerns that we all have in relationship to the treaty. Maybe I could just start a little bit about the kind of impacts that the treaty's had on Indigenous communities and throughout the Upper Columbia Basin. There's a quite poignant story about the elders in all the communities one day showing up to the river to harvest their salmon and their fish for the needs of their communities throughout the year, and showing up and the salmon weren't there. And I thought, something's wrong. Maybe we'll come tomorrow and the next day, and no salmon and no salmon. And from that day forward, there have been no salmon in the Upper Columbia. And there was no knowledge of that in the communities. And if you can imagine at that time, in the late 60s and early 70s, the salmon work is critically important to the Indigenous communities living throughout the basin. These are salmon people. We had a little bit of a sprinkle of a taste of what that means in terms of the importance of salmon, and Kupi Christian talked this morning about the importance of teaching the younger people how to harvest those salmon and the ceremonies around the salmon. And there's another element to that, which is what having salmon means to re-emboldening and reinvigorating the community dynamic, the distribution mechanisms within the communities for how you go about ensuring that everyone is taken care of, and the interaction between youth and elders during that journey of sharing the salmon in the communities. And that's been stripped from the communities. And it's had just a tremendous and monumentous impact, not just to the social dynamic, not just to the health, but also to the health of the communities. Diabetes is an epidemic in Indigenous communities, as it is in many places in North America, but particularly in Indigenous communities. And a lot of that is because of the changing of the natural diet and Indigenous foods, and the loss of those Indigenous foods, and replacing those with cans of Spam or hormone-riddled meat in Safeway. So this is something that's very personal, the renewal of the Columbia River Treaty, and it's something that we need to sort of pause for a moment and realize the importance of what this means, and to get it right. And not to take away from some of the aspects of the treaty that are quite interesting and profound and have been case studied around the world about the successes of an international agreement. When you measure it on flood control and power generation, sure, it's been effective. But how can you have it? How can you celebrate that when you see the treaty as an industrial access point, that it's an industrial reservoir now and not a river system? And so the communities have come together over the last number of years, and I want to thank our American relatives for helping us put that foot on that path. There was many years ago, about 8 years ago or 10 years ago, we were all invited down to the United States and to share in a 3 or 4 day discussion about the Columbia River Treaty renewal. And all of our communities independently were working quite vigorously to try to identify the pressure points and the avenues that we could start to exert some kind of influence over a new and better treaty, and a way to ensure that the environment is considered and water quality is considered and pollution is addressed and access to the abundance of the river is returned to those communities. And the Americans the U.S. tribes had spent quite a bit of time trying to put aside their own historical differences and political differences and so on, to try to focus on their commonalities. And that was a very inspiring meeting for our leadership. It was a very inspiring meeting for us as senior technical folks. And it allowed us to start to have a conversation in Canada about what are those common values that the Indigenous nations share amongst ourselves in regards to the Columbia River Treaty, and what do we need to see a better river system and a better treaty and a better relationship, and use this as an opportunity for us to enhance that relationship with each other and also with our non-Indigenous relatives in the basin. And I grew up in the Kootenays and right on the river system, and I know the kind of the stories that people talk about of the damage that it had to the settler community there. But there was a profound impact to the Indigenous people along the river system that flooded out sacred sites and village sites, burial grounds. The river now has a massive erosion cycle that has started to expose ancestral remains. And our elders say our ancestors are coming back and not in the right way, but they're coming back to remind us of the importance of the work that we have to do to get this right and to start to reinvigorate the treaty from an environmental perspective, not from an economic perspective or simply to try to preserve the infrastructure that was built on the nice flat valley bottoms of the river system, which are essentially the floodplains. So we work together now in a very enhanced way in Canada. We are focused on 4 principles, and those are starting to see the river, as we heard today, as one river system, not different considerations of the river where the irrigation folks are looking for more extraction for their purposes, and that's the end of their interest, where the power folks see the river as a power source first, and a river comes way down the road after that. We have to start to turn that all on its head and see what it naturally is, which is an ecosystem itself. So we don't get into the logic of sprinkling in or adding ecosystems, but we embrace that ecosystems is the river and that we're trying to protect and enhance those components of what the river is and represents so that it's sustainable for all of us. And that's really been the focus of our work. We want to ensure that we understand that the impacts to the flooding out of those valley bottoms and the loss of hundreds of thousands of species and huge amount of timber and the loss of carbon sinks is addressed in a meaningful way. And we start to consider where the sweet spot is in river flow regimes to ensure that the salmon and the fish can come back, and that we've got passage over Grand Coulee. We shouldn't be talking about we don't have passage in 2018. We've known for years that the science exists to get salmon over. We had a presentation this morning that talked about examples of salmon passage with truck and transport. There's new technology with these crazy whoosh cannons, but they apparently work. We can be doing more incrementally and holistically, and we need to challenge ourselves to do that and see that the river is a vehicle for us to enhance our own relationships on moving those issues forward in a comprehensive way. The other is we've entered a pretty dramatic change, as some of my co-panelists and Alexandra and Jim and others have highlighted, where Indigenous people now are recognized for the first time. That we now have an ability to have a voice at the table in a meaningful way, that there's a recognition that these infringements are occurring within their territories that have never been ceded, and that there has to be redress to that, and there has to be recognition of the centuries of knowledge and information that were used to manage those lands and to interact with that environment. And those have to be embedded within the treaty. We need to ensure that the traditional ecological knowledge is included, and that's something we're working for as well in the environmental component. And finally, governance. Well, second to final, governance. Decision-making. We've been actively, all our communities, all our nations have been actively re-enhancing the institutions of governance. We're now looking forward to the opportunity with the federal government in particular to support the infrastructure necessary and the capacity necessary to do that in a concentrated way so that we get over a hurdle and start to talk about governance as government again, and to ensure that those Indigenous institutions are given the wherewithal and the support to articulate the criteria for assessing projects in a transparent and understandable way, that the knowledge of the communities and the elders are inserted into that process and we move forward together. And lastly, this is the justice side of things, the social justice that fuels the change and to address the capacity and socioeconomic gaps that are inherent within the communities today. And that is, where's the meaningful share of the economic benefits into Indigenous communities? Billions of dollars have been harvested out of that river. Billions of dollars in the United States, billions of dollars in Canada. None of those funds, zero, have floated into the Indigenous communities. They continue to be marginalized. They continue to be subjugated from the decision-making process. And yes, we're in a wonderful era of beautiful words and court cases and the edge of change, but those are just words. As we see today, the first point that we have an opportunity to turn those words into action, we're denied the opportunity to sit in the room and determine the outcome of a treaty that affects those territories and those communities so monumentously. And that is unacceptable. It's unacceptable to everyday Canadians. It should be unacceptable to the decision makers in Canada. And I want to echo the words today that our previous speaker said, that I want to encourage all of you to join us in challenging our decision maker in Ottawa from relying on old practices and habits and not embracing the opportunity for real change that will see a much more holistic and broader and healthy treaty at the end of the day. So, lim limt.
Good afternoon. My name's Ken Warren. I'm here representing Global Affairs Canada. I would like to thank the organizers of this symposium for the invitation to be with you here today, particularly my friend and colleague, Dr. Kim Hyatt. I also want to acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples on whose territories we're meeting today, and particularly for the incredibly warm welcome this morning from Elder May Sam and her wonderful song. But this is the topic today, of course, is the Columbia River Treaty. And I think it's remiss then to not also acknowledge the Indigenous nations of the Columbia Basin, the Tunaka, who I don't think are represented here today, to the Syilx, and to acknowledge leadership from the Penticton Band and officials and colleagues that I've worked many long years with on this particular file, and to Kupi Christian for representing the Secwepemc Nation here today. Your opening remarks this morning were powerful indeed, and I will be taking your words back to my government to tell them about the conversation here today. I want to spend a few minutes because I think a number of the people in the audience are perhaps not as familiar with the history of the Government of Canada's engagement with the Indigenous nations of the Columbia Basin, and take a few minutes to tell you about some of the highlights of the last years of experience since 2012, when we started working very closely with the province of British Columbia. We signed a memorandum of agreement to closely coordinate all of our engagement with the nations of the basin. The symposium website soon will have a brief written summary of that history, and I hope you'll have an opportunity to take a look at it in the days ahead. I'm just going to touch on a few of the highlights. We began at the outset back in 2012 by planning to engage on the full range of interests and values that the Indigenous nations have with respect to their territories in the basin and the Columbia River Treaty, and how those things intersect. Now, remember, 2012, that was political history 101. Mr. Harper was still in office in those days. And I can tell you that there was a big discussion about whether or not the engaging on that full range of interests and values was the right thing to do. We were all reading the Haida decision very carefully, and there were those in our governments who thought, don't do anything more than is legally required. Well, we pushed back on that, and it's a good thing we did, because things have really changed since. one thing, I just want to make two observations about the early work we did with British Columbia in the first couple of years when we were still talking about the review of the future of the Columbia River. At that time, the question was whether or not Canada ought to terminate, and we also had to think about the changes to flood control. We were engaged with 6 different Indigenous groups during those years. The Tunuka Nation, which had already done some amazing work to finalize or to visualize the concept of a Tunuka Nation with a single government to represent those people. At the same time, the Silk people, represented by the Okanagan Nation Alliance, had also made some significant developments, some significant milestones in their own vision for nationhood and self-determination. The Secwepemc, as Kupi Christian this morning told us, does not have a central government or administrative organization. And we were directed instead, back in those early days, to engage directly with the chiefs of the divisions and the communities. And that's what we did. And I want to remember that because I want to come back to that in a few moments, because that is changing significantly. So we had 6 different engagements, and they were all different because all of the nations are unique and distinguishable and different. But what was significant to us was that even though we were meeting with them separately over a period of years, the interests and values and concerns that they expressed to us about what had happened to their territories as a result of this treaty were all the same. They were all the same. And that's what we have been hearing today. So it's not my decision, it's not my role here today to tell you or share with you the interests and concerns of the nations, because they are speaking with their own voices. When the British Columbia government made its decision to continue the treaty, we then turned our minds to asking 2 questions. And just at the time that Mr. Trudeau was being elected, we posed 2 questions to the nations. What changes did they want to see to the treaty? And how did they want to be engaged during negotiations? So a substantive question and a procedural question. And that procedural question led directly to the discussion about a seat at the table in the negotiating room. And as we've learned recently, that question is still very much alive, unresolved, and there's considerable dispute and concern about the views, about the decision that Kupi Christian told you about this morning, when our chief negotiator on May 17th informed the nations of the Government of Canada's decision not to invite the nations to be represented in the Canadian delegation at the negotiating table. Before May 17th, however, there were a number of other significant developments. In 2016, the Canadian chief negotiator invited the representatives of the 3 nations to meet with the negotiating team in Vancouver. And for the first time, we had representatives and leadership from each of the 3 nations sitting at one table with the Columbia River Treaty negotiators for the Government of Canada. And at that time, we started a conversation about building and formalizing a working relationship to develop Canada's negotiating position and to plan for negotiations with the United States in which the nations would have a a clear voice. We made it clear we wanted to understand how the advice from the nations would be used by our negotiators to formulate the Government of Canada's negotiating position at the negotiating table. We began work on terms of reference, and very early this year in 2018, the conversation made a significant change. We had said, we want to use our engagement with these nations in preparation and during the negotiation of the treaty with the United States as a way to demonstrate, just one way, that we were implementing, the Government of Canada was implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And central to that was the concept embedded in the Declaration of free, prior, and informed consent. So since February, the pace of our engagement accelerated significantly. We were now engaging bi-weekly, telephone and a monthly meeting face-to-face where all of the nations were in the room with the negotiators. We were developing what we called a negotiating framework, which we hoped when that work was finished, we would have a way that would effectively provide an Indigenous voice at the negotiating table when we sat down with the Americans. Unfortunately, we are at some kind of an impasse at the moment. The relationship that we've worked hard to develop, and all parties have worked hard over the years to develop an effective, respectful, and trusting relationship. All of those concepts of trust and respect are now very much challenged and by our government's decision not to invite the nations to sit with us at the table. The negotiations begin in Washington, D.C. tomorrow, and there will be no Indigenous representative in the room. But we have heard the Indigenous voices through our engagement with you going back to 2012. The government understands the concerns that you've heard articulated here today by the nation's representatives. When the Government of Canada, the federal mandate, when Mr. Trudeau's cabinet, when Mr. Trudeau's cabinet was considering the negotiating mandate to give to global affairs negotiators, the three nations developed a joint written submission to the decision makers in cabinet, articulating and describing the interests that they had articulated to us throughout our engagement process. And those views in writing were considered by ministers when they made their mandate decision. So, as I conclude, I want to say that in all my experience, in all my years, I don't remember a time when our relationship has been so sorely tested as it is now. We're of the view, our government takes the view, that we must have a relationship with these nations that is effective and enables us to conclude the kind of negotiated agreements with the United States that the nations want. We must have Indigenous consent to the negotiated outcomes of this Columbia River Treaty. Now, it's still early days in the negotiations, but we're in a tough spot right now. And as Grand Chief Stuart Phillip is fond of saying, reconciliation is not for wimps. It's hard work. All of the grandiose policy statements that we hear from ministers are fine. But as Jay says, they're only words. We've got to put that into practice. And so we're going to have to work very hard together to achieve that, so that we can get the kind of negotiated outcome that we all want. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So I'd like to open up the floor for questions from the audience. We have a few minutes that you can direct any questions to our panelists.
What is the view of the United States government on participation of tribal representatives?
Yeah.
What is the view of the United States government on the participation of tribal representatives?
So it was a little bit before the First Nation representatives were told, April 10th actually, that the chief negotiator met with some tribal leaders and designated representatives and explained that there had been a decision made at the State Department that the tribes would not have a representative at the negotiating table. And I think that was publicly stated at the Lake Roosevelt Forum, April 25th. The tribes, like the First Nations when they received that answer, are deeply disappointed. They had a dinner meeting April 25th with the Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Francisco Palmieri. He had been at the Lake Roosevelt Forum delivering the keynote address. And they talked for a good 2.5 hours about all of the reasons the tribe should be sitting at the table. Because it is their resource, it's a shared resource. Sure, the treaty has a lot of great benefits, but with the tribe's participation, you can expand those benefits. And importantly, talking about ecosystem, you're talking about the tribe's resources given to them by the Creator, for which they have an obligation, which they take to their heart, that we need to preserve these for future generations. He maintained that the decision has been made, so they have formally requested in writing that the State Department reconsider that decision, particularly explaining why it would be in the best foreign policy interests of the U.S. to exclude the tribes from the negotiating table, and pointedly how they could distinguish the Salmon Treaty, where salmon is distinctly subject to U.S. v. Oregon, the case that controls harvest sharing between the tribes and non-tribal citizens in the basin, from water. Clearly the salmon are subject to the reserve rights of tribes. I think they overlook the fact that so is water. It provides the habitat that salmon swim in. So even executive order tribes that have agreements with the U.S., those agreements say that what is necessary for you to exercise the right, so it's habitat, it's water, needs to be protected as well. So the tribes will wait for a written explanation from the State Department and hopefully a decision that is more in common with the fact that the tribes actually participated in the negotiation of the Pacific Salmon Treaty. We're actually at the table negotiating elements of the Salmon Treaty and are now participating in the implementation. The president appoints a tribal representative to sit at the table as a commissioner. Secretary of State appoints an alternate commissioner. And they vote. The federal government actually doesn't vote in the Salmon Commission. States of Alaska, Washington, Oregon has a vote, and then the 24 treaty tribes have a vote. There are 3 votes, and that's what decides the U.S. section positions.
Can I just add a little bit to that? Just as a reminder, it wasn't that long ago that we were kind of in opposite scenarios. The United States, of course, had President Obama in power and federally, and he had appointed his negotiator, Brian Doherty, at the time, and Brian Doherty was in deep conversation with the sovereign tribal groups along the Columbia Basin about their role in the renegotiation process, and was quite open to investigating how that can be enhanced and move forward in a very iterative way, meaning at the table. And we were sitting in Canada with Stephen Harper as Prime Minister, who was busy trying not to be involved in the Columbia River Treaty and trying not to support UNDRIP and working in many ways against the interests of Indigenous people. So we were kind of looking to our U.S. relatives for them to blaze the trail, and then quite quickly that started to shift, and we had Trudeau in power, and the primacy of reconciliation and the primacy of recognition, the recognition and implementation of UNDRIP, and embracing of the Sokoteen decision, and we were then looking for, the U.S. tribal groups were looking to Canada to try to blaze the trail and create an opportunity for them to participate, because of course they had Donald Trump in the White House then. I just want to make a quick point about the benefits of having Indigenous role at the table. It's not just the right ethical thing to do. It's not just the right moral thing to do. It's not just the right potentially social and environmental thing to do. It's actually one that can be of tremendous support to Canada. We have our nations that I help represent all have constitutional rights entrenched, and those rights offer a backstop to potentially some pressures from the United States for concessions on water flows, environmental regimes, and so forth. And being in the room sends a pretty strong signal that those are taken very seriously. And the Americans are great believers in the power of optics, and who's in the room and who isn't is very powerful. It's not just a chip on our shoulder that we need to fulfill. This is something that's actually quite tangible and quite real. And we believe we're Canada's best friend in this process, and feel quite betrayed by it. So we have a lot of work to do to try to resolve this one way or another. Our chiefs are all meeting shortly to consider all their options. So we'll know. Stay tuned.
Other questions? Can I ask, so one acknowledgement I want to make is that Kathy Eichenberger, who was originally going to be on the panel today, is at the negotiations right now, or she's probably landing now in DC, so she couldn't be with us today, so I wanted to acknowledge that. The second question I would have is that could you state your name and if you have an affiliation, so that we just know who's in the room, would be great if you're asking questions.
My name's Alan McClash. I'm a retired lawyer who has no affiliation that would have any impact on the issues that are being considered here today. But I do think it would be beneficial to hear something more on the province of BC's position. And accordingly, I want to state the question as clearly as I could, so I've written it down. There's really two parts to it. Firstly, is it the policy of the BC government to A, admit or encourage the admission of First Nations into the negotiating room as either participants or observers, or alternatively, B, to remain neutral on that issue?
So thank you for the question. I'm going to keep my answer very short, but I do appreciate the question, and it's probably on a lot of people's minds. The decision as to the participants at the negotiating table is a federal decision, and we will continue working with our federal partners on contemplating next steps. B.
I have two questions. The first would be for Jim and Jay. I think it would be useful, Jim, if you could talk a little bit about Judge Simon and the directions for a biological opinion revisiting the biological opinion on the Columbia River, because I suspect many Canadians don't know about that. And my specific question is, how could the decision that Judge Simon is going to come up with, how could that affect ecosystem services and the aspirations of First Nations and tribal representatives?
Since the early 90s, there's been litigation over biological opinions listing salmon stocks in the Columbia River. What Mike is referring to is Judge Simon's decision that the current biological opinion was not adequate to the task of ensuring that those stocks would not become extinct. And I say extinct in the terms of the law because biologists would say extirpated. And then the adequacy of the review of the federal actions necessary to ensure that those stocks are not jeopardized. He said that the current biop was not adequate to the challenge because he did not see the survivals of the salmon stocks based on the tables that even the federal government brought, showing survivals over time. So he said we need more spill flows over the dams, not through the turbines, to improve the survival of juveniles. BPA has estimated that over the course, using the 80 water years that are used in the Columbia River Treaty, over the course of the spill requirement, it would average about $40 million a year to provide that additional spill. The judge also said that you should consider breaching Snake River dams as one of the alternatives in a Columbia River system operation review. I'd like you to consider that as one of the alternatives to see whether or not that improves survival by allowing the fish, the juveniles, to out-migrate through a breach in the earthen portion of the 4 dams in the Snake River would provide better survival benefits. What you're hearing from that is better flows, better spill. I think that is the same thing that the tribes are talking about, the First Nations, and the First Nations and actually all citizens of the basin would benefit from by changing the flow pattern, reestablishing or restoring some of the early spring and early summer freshet, which used to push the juveniles out of the system. Judge Simon's decision is going that direction. A modernized Columbia River Treaty should go in that direction as well, to the benefit of everyone. Appreciate that John mentioned the economics report that the tribes and several NGOs did with Earth Economics. The benefits of restoring salmon above Chief Joe and Grand Coulee are recognized in the northern BC fisheries and Southeast Alaska as well. I remember when I was working on the salmon treaty process, First Nation fishers said, we knew when Grand Coulee, when the gates closed, because we stopped catching those big fish off the northwest coast of Vancouver Island. So the benefits of integrating ecosystem-based function are the same thing that the judge is pointing the US in, but it's one river system. And there's a better integration if everyone is doing it together and setting up a new platform for how you share the power benefits and how you achieve a adequate level of flood risk management while ensuring that these other benefits that we've lost for so long are brought back to the system.
Great. Another question. I'm going to take one more question and then we'll move. We have some other folks to invite down to join us for a broader discussion. So Lisa at the back.
Hello. Why Isquis, Lisa Wilson, Okanagan Nation Alliance. Good morning, everybody. Lisa Wilson, or afternoon, I guess. It's been a long day. I have two questions. The first is for Jay. Jay, I was wondering if you could explain how First Nations have benefited from the $64 million, I think, or $1 billion out of the treaty so far.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I think I mentioned that the benefits come in a variety of forms to British Columbia. And it must be frustrating for British Columbia to have Canada as the lead negotiator on this, given that in the first iteration, British Columbia had a pretty definitive role in the outcome of the treaty, and that they are both the risk taker and beneficiary of the Columbia River Treaty in Canada, not Canada as the government. So that must be a bit of a challenge, but we can empathize without a doubt and then some. We don't. As I think Lisa's just asking me to make a point that none of the Indigenous nations benefit from in a financial way from the treaty at all. In fact, the communities carry the burden of the largest territorial infringement in their history outside of colonialism itself, and smallpox came shortly afterwards. And of course, we talked about fish passage, blockage, and so forth. But we do know that we can do it, and we do know that we rely on U.S. Tribal groups to continue to litigate and fight for the effort to ensure that there's passage, that the flows are there. We work together. We have for years to try to ensure that that occurs. Having some of those resources flow into the Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities for the benefits of spending in the ecosystem side, in the social development side, and closing the gap, and reinvigorating the institutions that we talked about, and so forth. That's really critical, and that's, and the resources are desperately needed to ensure that the development angle of Indigenous communities is supported and going in the right direction. And this is a source of revenue that is a no-brainer in our minds, and there should be a significant portion of those redirected, and we're going to do everything in our power to ensure that that happens. And I just want to point out that there are a variety of ways to do that, through trusts, through direct support and payments, et cetera. And those have a cyclical impact on the broader economy and rural development in general. And it's something that kind of feeds on itself and starts to grow. So thanks.
So we are going to start our part 2 of this panel. So I would like to invite Barb Cousins from the morning session, Chief Christian, if you'd like to join us. And yes, please stay. Yes, yeah, you're not going anywhere. And we have a couple of seats. Do you mind holding it for me? So we're going to get very cozy here.
Shouldn't use the zodiac reference. Green piece around the board.
Yeah, serious. So a reminder that, that Barb is from the University of Idaho, and she was our opening speaker this morning on giving us some context. And Chief Christian gave us a perspective from his nation's point of view. So what I'd like to do is, since we're talking about where we go from here, is to what we've been discussing today is, and going back to the original theme of the CWRA conference, which is on our common future, building resilience through innovation, and suggests that the case that we're talking about here is really about watershed governance. And what we're trying to do, and the discussions we've had today, are about the integration of science, of policy, of law, of culture, and economy, how it plays out, and how that plays out in a bound natural landscape, which in this case is the very precious Columbia River Basin. So throughout the day, we've heard about a lot of these technical issues and solutions and questions that are arising in that sense, and we had some questions as well that were raised about, well, so now what? And what are we going to do? And we've had a little bit of an initial discussion on where we're going and what we need to consider in terms of what's coming, in terms of the treaty. And what I'm going to offer for some of our discussion moving forward is that this is about, we're seeking innovation and social innovation, which this is a bit of a mishmash of a definition, but that it's really the process of developing and deploying solutions. This is what we're seeking, and challenging often systemic issues to support making our human and natural systems more adaptive and resilient. And I think that's what we're doing from a technical, scientific, cultural, political, legal, economic perspective. And so if we talk about innovation, it really has 2 criteria. So one is that it's novel. So you're doing something different. You're doing something, you might be using the same kind of an approach, but you're using it in a different context. Or secondly, you're making an improvement. It's more effective, it's more efficient, it's got better value in some way. And secondly, the process can be innovative, and we've heard a little bit about that today in terms of how we're getting to the new treaty, ways that you're doing science differently, the way that modeling can be used differently. We have different tools that we didn't have before. How can we apply them differently in the context of a modernized treaty? And ultimately, I think that we've all been talking about a new treaty that is going to, or I guess that technically I shouldn't say that, a modernized treaty for the future that is going to incorporate all of the issues that have been discussed today. But the big question is how? How do we get there? How do we do it? What are the processes that we need to get there? And I'd like to invite us to think through that in this next part of our discussion. So I have some of your questions that were submitted on cards, so we'll get to that as well. But I would like to pose a question to the challenge about, and maybe I'll start with you, Barbara, because you alluded to some of this in this morning. And that is, from your perspective, what would be the most important change that we would need to see to get us to a very different and innovative treaty? We need to give her some more leave.
We're tearing down the plants
Yeah.
here. So, that would not be the most important thing. I think, going back to what has been a theme since this morning, and that is the inclusiveness of the process, both of negotiating a modernized treaty and of implementing it. When you have representation of the interests in the basin, not just a subset, but all of the interests in the basin, you tend not to miss things. You tend to have more creativity. You tend to have more ideas at the table. And the broader sort of system of the Columbia River begins to be represented within the negotiations, not just narrower economic values that, that we've developed in the past. And so I think that one change, having a more inclusive process, then would lead to the other things that people are seeking in a modernized treaty. Those ideas would come to the table.
Thanks. Does anybody else want to add anything to that?
I just want to add that we had the fortune, all the Canadian nations and even the U.S. tribes of working with Barb and her colleagues, Rich and Matt, all professors of law, and we worked on a thing called the University Consortium, and that gave the leadership on both sides of the border the legal confidence to pursue this seat at the table. That the outcomes of that lengthy study was essentially, I mean, there was a multitude of outcomes, but one of the real critical ones for us was that there aren't any legal impediments for Indigenous nations to be represented legitimately at that table on both sides. That everything else was an excuse, and that gave us great resolve and great confidence to pursue that. And in order to get to exactly where we're talking about today, that adding another perspective in the heart of the discussion will result in a more balanced and broad and multitude of spectrum outcome. And that's really what we're hoping to do still.
So specifics, you heard today about the assured operating plan done 6 years out, by which the Canadian entitlement is measured from the downstream power benefits. And that's modified by the detailed operating plan, which is then modified in season by a supplemental operating agreement, which includes a non-power uses agreement that you heard about, which provides 1 million acre feet for salmon. Now, all of those are done consistent with the storage reservation diagrams that I believe Kelvin showed you, and you're trying to make sure that those two things are operating correctly. And to do ecosystem, you're peeling away from those. And that's what Barb was getting at. If you integrate it, and what the tribal leaders and First Nation leaders are talking about, don't come to us and consult with us about what'll work. Let's get together, let's sit down and actually collaborate on the modeling, add another purpose to what we're modeling for. And that way we're not peeling layers off the onion to get back to where we could get some of the things. But if we actually set up a system where we're integrating these three purposes, then we can make sure that we're hitting all of them on the right cylinders. For some metaphors.
And I'll add to that, but I can't think of any mixed metaphors right now. But before being an academic, I was a negotiator and mediator of water agreements. And I've never been in a room where you can't, if you get more creativity in the room and you step back and try and take a broader look at what you're doing, you can't find more ways to enhance the benefits for everyone in the room. We live in Canada and the United States, two of the wealthiest nations in the world. In the Columbia River, we have abundant resources. We are not at that point that we can't do it better. And we're rapidly developing technology that's going to help us with things like energy production and moving energy around with less loss. So that, exactly as Jim is saying, it's having everyone in the room that helps you expand the pie. It really usually is not, in complex negotiations, a zero-sum game.
I'd like to put another question out there, and that is, we heard about the need for resiliency and to be able to employ adaptive management in a treaty moving forward. Because we have so much uncertainty, at the same time, we know that a bilateral treaty has certain constraints around what that can do. And so I would like to get the opinion of folks on the panel as to, are there things that we think are essential that need to be in the treaty, and that there need to be parallel processes or mechanisms? We heard a couple of examples of how science could feed into decision making. So I'd like some commentary on what, in terms of making this different and making it more adaptive and resilient and reflective of different values. Does anybody have examples or ideas around how they think that could happen? Chief Christian?
Yeah, I think the dynamics of this whole process, if you really want to change the nature of what's going on, we need to be in the room. BC needs to step out, and we as First Nations need to step into the room. And that'll change the whole dynamic in terms of what you're talking about. Canada needs to really think about that, and rather than inviting British Columbia to the table, invite us. You know, simply because British Columbia, in the context of title, is imposing their will on our title. And I think that's what's going on in this whole process. Because Aboriginal title is underlying even Crown title. It's alleged Crown land in British Columbia. So what Canada could do to change this whole process is bring us into the room. And you talk about a process that would change the dynamic completely, that would do it. And it's in the power of Canada to do that. And I think that's what Canada needs to think about.
Thank you for that suggestion. But from my point of view, I think from our government's point of view, we wouldn't want to approach it as a mutually exclusive choice. We need British Columbia at the table. We need British Columbia in the room. British Columbia operates the system on behalf of Canada, and we need them. But we need the nations as well. And in pursuing the Barbara's point about inclusiveness, I think your point is, let's add people, not remove them.
Any other comments? Are there any pressing, I have a pile of questions here that have come from the floor. If there are no burning questions out there that people want to stand up and ask, I'll read a question. Okay. Can we get a mic over there, please, to the gentleman with the green shirt?
Thank you. I have more of a statement than a question. My name is Mark Lorang. I'm from Montana. I'm a retired professor from the University of Montana, and I work very closely with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe. They own Kerr Dam. They are at the table. You cannot get rid of them. And it's one river, it's one nation. Align yourself with these people. I know them very well. They are very professional. They have a college. They offer a degree in hydrology. It's the only one in the United States run by a tribal nation. And go for it. You're not out of the table. That's your step in today. Thank you very much.
Okay, is there another question up there? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of baffled, given what Barb has just talked about with respect to inclusiveness and this not being a zero-sum game and how decisions get better the more views you consider. And given what we heard from the federal and provincial people working diligently and genuinely towards moving in this direction. When I make a decision, I think about the pros and the cons and the benefits and the costs. What a two-part question, I suppose. What are the pros? What are the advantages of excluding First Nations? And the second part would be how could those advantages outweigh the disadvantages of excluding First Nations? So that's the first two-part question. How could the feds think that excluding First Nations would be advantageous? And the second question is, what if this decision stands, what will be the federal strategy to meet the new standard of achieving consent?
I think that's for you, Ken.
Those are all good questions. Very good questions. And we have more work to do.
I'm going to risk channeling, I think, what some of the folks in the US are thinking, that it's a treaty that has worked well since it was implemented for the purposes for which it has been implemented. And I've actually heard one person say, why complicate it by overlaying ecosystem function? We can mitigate or compensate for those effects. And I think that may be what's driving some of the decisions on the US side.
I'll just purely speculate, channeling like Jim is. But a lot of negotiators, particularly when they're representing a government that has a very diverse population and set of interests, feel that they can speak more freely and sort of put everything on the table and talk about it more if they're behind closed doors. And having done negotiations for governments in the past, I would just say if any of them are listening now, that's a big mistake, because on both sides of the border, there is still a public process that occurs to ratify whatever comes out of these negotiations. And in every negotiation I've seen that involves a public resource that people are dependent on and where people live, when you do it behind closed doors, it breaks down and doesn't get to that final stage. So pure speculation as to whether that might be one of the driving reasons, but if it is because of the nature of the resource that they're dealing with, I would suggest that it's unwise.
But just a postscript to my earlier answer, our vision of how to proceed with this negotiation was never to keep secrets from the nations. I'm to have a period of professional negotiation in my past, and there is a point to finding an appropriate balance between accessibility and efficiency, which usually means some portion of a negotiation does occur behind closed doors. But the challenge for us is to find the right mixture. And this is a conversation which clearly is continuing. I mentioned in my opening remarks that we've been discussing the question of seat at the table actively since late 2015, early 2016. And I venture to say, Jay, you correct me if you think I might be mistaken here, we've probably spent more time talking about that procedural question than we have about the substantive issues for actual negotiation. So our vision, our government's vision was that, and this is a conversation that we have had with the nations as we've developed this negotiating framework that I mentioned in my opening remarks. We see a certain rhythm associated with this negotiation process whereby we begin, let's say, with the agenda for tomorrow's first negotiating session in DC. Our intention on May 17th at that meeting in Vancouver was to go through that agenda together with the nation's representatives to get detailed insight and advice from the nations on how our negotiators should speak about as we work through that agenda. And then we proposed a subsequent session after the negotiation in which we would have a thorough and comprehensive debrief of what was discussed with the United States afterwards. That was the kind of sequence that we have in mind, that we think is reflected in the draft of that framework document that we've been working on since February, that is focused around the concept of securing the free, prior, informed consent of the Indigenous nations. You remember, Jay, we had a brief meeting in the airport here in Victoria. I wasn't at that February meeting, and I said, so how did it go? And you told me about, well, we switched the conversation to consent. And on the quotation that, on my slide that was visible during my opening remarks, the second paragraph is from the Government of Canada's Principles to Guide Our Relationship with Indigenous Nations. And that's number 6. And it clearly says we are seeking free, prior, and informed consent. The question is how to achieve it, how to make it real, and how to bring it into play in an effective and efficient way at the negotiating table. Now, that's the approach we took. It's not been accepted by the leadership of the nations, and so our conversation with them must continue.
Thanks for that, Ken. Nothing personal, but you can't have it both ways. You can't have the credit for the language of free and prior and informed consent and the implementation of UNDRIP and not have it articulated in practice and experienced in practice. To be told don't worry, this is great news, you're in the back room somewhere, and we're going to talk to you beforehand and perhaps afterwards, and we're going to have a great conversation is not consent, and it's not the new way towards reconciliation. So I know you and I have had conversations about this, so that's perhaps nothing new to you, but it certainly is important to note here publicly. And I also want to make another point, which is one of timing. From our perspective, we're not ready to negotiate. Not the Indigenous nations. No one is ready. We don't know, none of us know exactly what is the exact scenario for salmon migrating up and down into the system with any kind of precision. We don't know what the bookends are in a water flow regime for a variety of environmental needs. We haven't had the wherewithal, the funding, the support to study those on our side, and let alone, I'm not sure if the United States is way ahead of us on this, but we know the Corps and the power companies have their own budgets and they don't need to share that information with us, so I'm sure they're miles ahead on their interests, which of course are systemic and inherent within the current system, and within the current agreement. But for articulating change, we're trying to negotiate with not one but both hands tied behind our back. And how do we have an expectation that we're going to have a better and more holistic and wide open agreement when we're not finished the studies, and some of them we haven't even begun yet. So it's a dangerous road we're going down, I think, in many ways, and we have to all sit down and be real about it and try to work together to come to a solution. But the kind of disrespect that the nations have been shown by, to use Kubi Christian's word today, unilaterally told, in many ways like school children, that you're not going to be involved in a negotiating process, and then not have any space to have a conversation about what variety or range or potential opportunities there may still exist, and then be told it's going to be this way, you're going to be in the back room, but don't worry, it's great, is a long way from where we should be today. So, limit.
I'm going to ask a question related to the issue that we've just been talking about and what you just mentioned, Jay, in terms of institutional arrangements. And so this is a question from the crowd of, there appears to be a need for an international institutional arrangement like a Columbia Basin Secretariat to enable joint negotiations, studies, planning, management, stakeholder engagement with the collaboration of First Nations. A yes or a no?
That would be something constructive. It was actually something that the chief negotiator for the U.S. had started with the encouragement of the tribes. I think a lot of what you've heard is collaboration is where you get to an answer that makes the most sense. The way that we got to a regional recommendation from the U.S., that the entity came to the tribes and said, we'd like to consult with you. The tribal leaders I work for said, nah, we'd like to collaborate. We want our staff sitting down with your technical staff, and then we want them to come back to report to us collectively, U.S. entity and tribal leaders, on what they've learned through the technical modeling. That was the proposal, to have a collaborative modeling work group that both countries would be using. I think it just became unwieldy. It is not something that could be discarded. We collectively, the U.S. and the Canadian negotiating teams, could agree that a collaborative modeling work group would still make sense. Because on the U.S. side, even going through the regional recommendation process, we didn't come to even the penultimate modeling scenario, because it was recognized that you would have to do this with the Canadian partners before you knew what was going to work to meet the three purposes. We were still doing that on the U.S. side up until 2 months ago, I guess.
Jay, that's a real concern if we envision a negotiation in which it's relatively quick and prescriptive, and then we shut it down, wrap it in a ribbon, and we all go about the rest of our about implementation. But alternatively, there's been a lot of discussion about adaptive management and flexibility. What if alternatively our vision for the negotiation is different, whereby we have a negotiation that's included, the results of which are included in the treaty, that permit ongoing work? Because I take your point. There are no quick answers to many of the most pressing challenges that have been that society has put on the table in the 50-odd years that the treaty's been in effect. So what if we approach this as an adaptive governance arrangement, so that those long-term studies that must be done can occur even after a modified treaty, under the umbrella of a modified treaty that provides for that kind of adaptive, future, ongoing work.
Did you want to?
No, go ahead. Last comment.
So I think Ken is spot on that. You've heard today that not only have energy markets changed substantially since 1964, but they're at the rate of acceleration of technology development today. Who knows what they're going to do in the next 60 years? We have climate change, so we have high uncertainty in terms of water temperatures and periods of drought and greater floods within the basin. And then you have the uncertainty of changing values among the participants of the basin and changes in the economies they rely on. And a treaty that can sustain itself, been a long day, for the future and withstand the test of time is one that can evolve. And so I think that goes back to the institutional arrangements. Can you set up something that is set up to authorize the science that needs to be done on an ongoing basis and the monitoring and the feedback from that? Can you set up something that has the kind of oversight board that can make decisions in the face of change, in the face of feedback from that? And can you have enough flexibility, which is a challenge at the international level? We're often nervous to do that, but if any shared international basin can do it, it is this one shared between the US and Canada, because we tend to be able, and the treaty has shown that, to be more creative in our implementation of agreements and to allow a little bit more flexibility than we might with other international partners.
Barbara, I think you might have wrapped it up there for me. Thank you. I'm conscious that it's 5:15. And I want to thank our large and patient and articulate panel for addressing some really key and difficult challenges. I think we all acknowledge, but that we're sitting here together having the discussion and trying to understand how all of the amazing science and technical work that's being done to try and understand the system can be integrated into the way that we govern and make decisions more effectively for the future of the treaty. And Chief Christian?
I just wanted to just leave this, is that we've talked about, the technical, the science and all that. One thing we have not talked about is the spiritual aspect of water and our connection to that part of the world and to the salmon. We talked a bit about it in our culture. But it's really important, I think, we begin to understand that water has a living spirit. In our language, we call them Kelmatetko, the water people. And it's a real integral part of who we are as a people and our connection to that water. And so I think when you're talking, and all the science and everything we're doing, you have to always remember that in our blood is our DNA that's been on this land for 10,000 years. And people think we don't have this kind of knowledge, but it's in our blood. The ceremonies, and when we go and do those types of things, those things are called back, and our ancestors are helping us with this work. It's kind of like the Western science is showing as an example that in the DNA of Holocaust survivors, the people that never experienced the Holocaust have that memory. And that's the science your Western science has shown, and that Western science also shows then that in our DNA is all the good things that our people have done for 10,000 years on the land. And that's why it's so important, any kind of institutional development for the Columbia River, the one river in the water, is we need our traditional ecological knowledge keepers as part of it. It can't just be Western science. We need our spiritual component. It's a big part of how we survived for thousands of years on this land. And I wanted to say that because we haven't had much discussion on that part of it. And it's really important that you understand that our connection to the water, our connection to the land, our connection to the animals and all that is very deeply seeped in our language and in our ceremonies. So I think you need to understand that. You can go and talk about all the things you're talking about, but at the end of the day, it's that water, and you heard a bit about it, how it gives life. And so we honor that, and it's really important you all understand that as we move this discussion forward, that needs to be honored. And I think it's an important part of who we are as a people on this land for 10,000 years. And we carry the DNA of our ancestors in the work that we do today. So I just wanted to close with that, and it's really important. So I wanted to say that.
Thank you. It's a perfect closing. We do have, I believe, Oliver and John. John is going to provide some closing remarks for all of us, and then you will be onward to your next adventure with the conference or with the reception here. So thank you for your attention and participation in this round, and I will pass it over to John. And thanks again to the panelists so much.
So it's been a long day, and Oliver and I agreed that we would, I would talk on his behalf and keep it relatively short. So I will do that. I'll be done in 10 minutes, so you can get out of here at 5:30. First off, I wanted to thank the organizers one more time. I think people now realize how much work has gone into this symposium based on all of the presentations being made of the day. But specifically, I want to thank the CWRA, who provided a lot of logistical support, the POLIS Center for Ecological Governance, and the Center for Global Studies, and the support staff who have helped make this conference work on a logistical basis. And I should thank, too, what is commonly known or colloquially known as the Old Farts, which are a group of people, Bruce Matlock and Mike Miles and Kim Hyatt, and sometimes myself, who sort of helped to provide some of the organization to this conference with support of staff from CWRA. But more importantly, I'd like to thank you all for your attendance and your questions and your interests. This would not been so much fun without an audience and an engaged audience like you are. And you've shown in the true sense of the term resiliency by staying here for the best part of 8 hours. I think I'd like to have a few points just to cement in my mind anyway what I learned, and these are points that Oliver and I have shared. So there are 4 that I'm going to leave you with and then talk about next steps. The first of the 4 is the whole question of water security. I think one of the key lessons I've learned since my involvement in the Columbia is that with a changing climate and mixed values coming to the fore, that water use is becoming more insecure. So if you think about it over the next 20 or 30 years, a lot of what we've taken to be working well, flood control, power, navigation, recreation, that's becoming less secure as time passes. And one of the things that has to be done is to make sure that we develop a treaty that deals with changing water security in an imaginative way. So climate change we've talked about, the changing demands for water use and for energy use, the importance of nature and fisheries, how that's changed in the 60 years of the Columbia Treaty, the obvious role and engagement of the Indigenous peoples in the process, and the new engagement with communities. And as Bob Cousins says, when you start to engage more and more people, more and more ideas come out to solve this overall question of how do we make water secure in the Columbia Basin. The second key concept is reconciliation. And we've talked a lot about reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, the need to bring that into a better place than it is right now. And I'm sensing from what I hear this afternoon, there may be a review of the federal position, both at the US level and Canadian level in terms of engagement with First Nations more formally in the negotiation process down the road. But secondly, in reconciliation is a need to reconcile our role with nature. And the comment that Jim said that some people don't feel that we should be bringing ecosystem function in simply doesn't wash with me. The reasons why the Columbia will be successful as we go down the road is because there is a true engagement with nature and all its manifestations in the basin. And that is a new reality of today's world. So we need to reconcile not only our relationships with Indigenous people, but yet and collectively recognize and reconcile our role with nature. The third key word is innovation, and Zita talked about that in terms of social innovation. There will be no solutions to the Columbia by using old systems and old approaches. We have to have much more imaginative and creative approaches to solving the many layers of the Columbia going forward in flood control and fisheries, and more importantly, in distributing equitably the benefits, not only between Canada and BC, but directly with First Nations as well. So we need social innovation, and we need a mechanism to bring that social innovation to the negotiating table as we move forward. And the final point is scale and process. I've had, since I've been involved in the Columbia for the last 4 years, I've been acutely aware that a Columbia River treaty based on the river is simply too limiting for the nature of the Columbia Basin. We have to make the scale of the Columbia Basin, not just the Columbia River. I mean, technically speaking, the Okanagan-Similkameen system, around which we've spent 25% of our time talking about today, is not included in the treaty. So the Columbia is too important a basin to be limited to the river. And so I think that question that Zita asked at the end, do we need some kind of a more innovative governance model to deal with the basin, I don't think was fully answered, but my answer is yes, we do. So finally, when you look at scale and process, I think the comments at the very end are the most pertinent of today's. That this is not going to be a treaty that's negotiated and then it's run for 60 years and then we come back in 2018 and have another go at it. This is going to be a completely different model of flexibility, adaptation, and continuous improvement. And we need to have a body of science that is continuing to inquire both social science, ecological science, economic science, and spiritual science. And that needs to continue the inquiry to making the Columbia, to use the words of our famous president to the south, make the Columbia great again. So I would like to just comment on two things of where we go next. One is there will be an output. In other words, there'll be some proceedings, a summary of the major points that were made today in the presentations that will be collected and put in some kind of a document that you'll get access to. Don't know exactly how that will take place, but there will be a written document which summarizes the key conclusions of our session. Then the other thing which is more important is outcomes. How do we make the output an outcome and start to change the way we go forward? And that is I'm leaving to you folks. So what we do collectively on outcomes is what you individually in your various institutional setups want to take from this and move forward and where you go with making the Columbia great again. So I'm going to leave that to you folks, but on behalf of all of the organizers, I want to thank you very much for your attention and your engagement and your energy. Thank you.